In the shadowed halls of Hampton Court Palace, where heavy tapestries hid more than bare stone walls, a king's hunger would alter the destiny of a nation. Henry VIII's desires didn't merely unravel 6 marriages. They shattered centuries of religious tradition, tore England from Rome, and left behind a trail of executed queens and discarded lovers that horrified even the most hardened Tudor courtiers. This isn't just the story of royal excess. It is the chilling chronicle of how one man's unchecked compulsions became instruments of state terror, turning bedchambers into courtrooms and wedding vows into death sentences. Henry Tudor rose to the throne in 1509 as England's Golden Prince. Tall, athletic, and educated, he seemed every inch the perfect Renaissance monarch. To his Spanish bride, Katherine of Aragon, and to the realm at large, he embodied the chivalric ideals of romance and kingship. Contemporary accounts describe his commanding 6-foot frame, his long auburn hair, and his dazzling performances in the tilt yard, where he reigned supreme in jousts and tournaments. Yet, beneath this radiant facade stirred appetites that would swell into something far more dangerous. Even in his earliest years, court watchers noticed his roving eye and his belief that virility was divine proof of his right to rule. England in the early 16th century was still bound tightly to Catholic doctrine, where marriage was sacred and adultery could mean ruin. But the Tudor court operated on another level, a glittering, perilous world where access to power outweighed moral law and where royal favor could lift or destroy a family in an instant. In this hothouse atmosphere, Henry's pursuits became a game of survival, one few could refuse without risking destruction. Mistresses were not unusual among European kings, but Henry transformed the practice into something uniquely cruel. Unlike Francis I of France, who indulged in discreet affairs, Henry wielded his conquests as weapons of humiliation. He paraded his mistresses openly, forcing Katherine to endure their presence and to watch as her ladies, some still in their teens, emerged from his chambers wearing jewels and draped in silks that marked them as royal prizes. The mythology surrounding Henry's manhood was carefully cultivated by propaganda and reinforced by his own delusions. He convinced himself that his potency was a divine sign, that God had chosen him not merely to rule, but to display masculine supremacy on the battlefield and in the bedroom. This warped theology would become the foundation for his later split with Rome. If God had granted him such appetites, then surely the Pope's refusal to annul his marriage to Katherine was nothing less than heresy. Katherine of Aragon endured 24 years of public humiliation with a grace that only seemed to further inflame Henry's resentment. Her unforgivable crime was to grow older, to suffer miscarriages, and to fail in producing the male heir Henry saw as his birthright. Records describe how he visited her chambers less and less, while his mistresses grew ever younger. Katherine was forced to smile through her pain, welcoming these women into her household even as she knew the truth of their service. Among Henry's earliest documented lovers was Elizabeth Blount, Bessie, who bore him his first acknowledged illegitimate son in 1519. Henry's joy at the child's birth was so great that he nearly legitimized him, granting the boy the title of Duke of Richmond and showering him with honors meant for a true prince. It was a deliberate insult to Katherine, proof to all that the failure of heirs was her fault, never his. But it was the arrival of the Boleyn sisters that changed everything. Mary Boleyn, the elder, was a willing participant, earning the cruel nickname the Great Whore from jealous courtiers. She bore Henry at least one child, perhaps 2, though he never acknowledged them as he had Richmond. Mary understood her role: to offer pleasure, to accept gifts, and to fade away when his attention shifted. When he grew bored, she was hastily married to a lesser noble and cast aside. Her children's paternity remained an open secret that no one dared voice. Then came Anne Boleyn, and with her, Henry's desires turned from private indulgence to public catastrophe. Unlike her sister, Anne refused to become another discarded mistress. Having watched Mary's fate, she played a dangerous game, withholding herself while inflaming Henry's longing with wit, intelligence, and carefully staged glimpses of intimacy withheld. For 7 years she kept England's most powerful man in a fever of frustrated desire. His letters to her, still preserved, reveal his obsession. In one he writes of longing to kiss her breasts, which he called her pretty duckies, and of his desperate wish to be in her arms. These words, shocking in their time, expose a king reduced to begging, promising Anne the world in exchange for what she refused to give. The balance of power had shifted. For the first time, Henry was not the predator, but the pursuer, and the desperation drove him to extremes that reshaped Christianity itself. Anne's hold over him was so consuming that he was willing to break with 1,000 years of religious authority to have her. The annulment of his marriage to Katherine of Aragon dragged on for 6 years, during which Henry's frustration curdled into paranoia. Observers noted his violent temper, his erratic moods, and his conviction that those who opposed his remarriage were opposing God himself, whose will, he claimed, was made manifest through his own body. By 1533, with Anne finally in his bed and carrying the child he was certain would be a son, Henry severed ties with Rome. He declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, tearing the nation from papal authority and rewriting divine law to suit his desires. In his eyes, this was liberation. To others, it was the start of a terror where private lust had become national destiny. Anne's pregnancy was celebrated as England's salvation, proof that the king's gamble would yield the male heir he craved. But when the child born was not a son but Elizabeth, Henry's triumph soured into bitterness. What had once been passion soon became disdain, and Anne's precarious rise would transform into a nightmare that ended at the scaffold. Yet in that moment, in the breaking with Rome, in the reshaping of English religion itself, Henry's private obsession had become public revolution. His bedchamber was no longer merely the scene of indulgence. It had become the crucible in which the future of England was forged. The sexual had become political, the personal had turned theological. Henry's obsession with Anne Boleyn had cost England its place in Catholic Europe. Yet in his mind, it was liberation. No priest or pope could now tell him whom he could marry or bed. But when Anne gave birth not to the long-promised son, but to a daughter, Elizabeth, the seeds of her downfall were planted. The passion that had consumed Henry for 7 long years burned out with frightening speed. Within mere months of their marriage, he was already casting his eye toward Jane Seymour, one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting. The pattern was repeating, but this time the stakes were higher and the consequences more deadly. Anne, unlike Katherine of Aragon, had no powerful royal relatives to shield her. She had risen too far, made too many enemies, and when Henry's desire soured, she could not simply be divorced. She had to be destroyed. The charges brought against Anne reveal the monstrous extremes of Henry's obsession. It wasn't enough to remove her. She had to be utterly annihilated, reduced from queen to pariah in the public imagination. She was accused of adultery with 5 men, including her own brother. The accusations were so absurd that even Henry's judges struggled to convict. But the outcome had already been decided. The message was clear. If Henry's desire had made her queen, his disgust could unmake her just as swiftly. Her execution in 1536 sent a chilling message to every woman in England. Jane Seymour, Henry's new obsession, had little time to grasp her new status before she was pregnant with the future Edward VI. She died 12 days after childbirth, perhaps the luckiest of Henry's wives, for she escaped before affection could curdle into hatred. Henry's grief seemed genuine, but it did not keep him from searching almost immediately for wife number 4. His advisers, by now well aware of their master's dangerous appetites, scoured Europe for a bride who could serve both diplomacy and desire. What followed was the debacle of Anne of Cleves, which revealed another aspect of Henry's unstable sexuality, his demand for immediate physical attraction and his violent reaction when it was absent. Chosen from a flattering portrait, Anne arrived in England only for Henry to declare her unbearably ugly. He claimed he could not consummate the marriage, and his complaints about her appearance became a matter of state. Physicians and courtiers were forced into the humiliating position of debating the king's performance in bed. Anne endured the shame of being publicly rejected and insulted, her humiliation paraded before the entire court. To Henry, his preferences were not private, they were matters of national importance. While the annulment with Cleves was still being arranged, Henry's attention turned to Katherine Howard, Anne Boleyn's teenage cousin. Here, Henry's predations reached their darkest point. Katherine was no older than 15 when the nearly 50-year-old king pursued her, perhaps younger when she was first introduced at court with the intent of catching his eye. The Howard family, having seen the power Anne Boleyn briefly wielded, pushed their young relative forward, essentially sacrificing her to satisfy the aging tyrant's obsession. Katherine Howard's story is perhaps the most tragic of Henry's victims. Already exploited as a girl in her uncle's household, she was thrust into the arms of a king who was now morbidly obese, plagued by a festering leg wound, and consumed by paranoia. Accounts suggest she was terrified of him but forced to play the role of the eager young bride. Unlike Anne, who had wielded intelligence to survive, Katherine was a child thrown into a deadly game she could never hope to control. Henry, deluded by his fantasies, convinced himself she genuinely desired him. Her youth became his proof of vitality, his desperate attempt to see himself as still vigorous. He showered her with jewels and called her his rose without a thorn, blind to the fear in her eyes. When word emerged of her premarital relationships that today would be recognized as abuse, Henry's fantasy shattered. His reaction was volcanic. To him, Katherine was no longer his rose, but a betrayal of the image he had so carefully crafted. In 1542, Katherine was executed, barely out of childhood. According to witnesses, she practiced how to place her head on the block, a child rehearsing how to die with dignity. Alongside her was executed Jane Boleyn, the same woman who had testified against her own husband to bring down Anne. Her death was a grim reminder that in Henry's twisted world, even accomplices were ultimately expendable. The court, horrified, watched yet another queen destroyed for failing to meet Henry's impossible standards. By the time Henry married his sixth wife, Catherine Parr, in 1543, his sexual appetites had waned, curbed by disease and infirmity. Weighing well over 400 pounds, plagued by chronic infections and possibly diabetes, Henry was reduced to a bloated invalid. Yet even then, Parr lived in constant fear. She had seen too clearly what happened to queens who displeased him. She carefully played the role of nurse and companion rather than lover, steering the king's moods with calculated deference. Even so, she nearly faced execution for heresy when her religious opinions crossed him. Henry's obsessions, however, extended far beyond his 6 wives. Court records hint at numerous unnamed women who endured his advances. Servants who could not refuse, minor nobles whose families sought advantage in royal bastards, and foreign visitors who found themselves propositioned by a king who viewed sexual conquest as a form of diplomacy. The fortunate ones received gifts or payoffs and disappeared quietly. The less fortunate, those who became pregnant or spoke too freely, often met darker ends. Behind the pageantry and the grandeur, a shadow network of victims surrounded Henry's reign, their names erased but their suffering embedded in the fabric of Tudor history. Perhaps the most chilling element of Henry's practices was his use of religion to sanctify them. Having declared himself head of the church, he could literally rewrite divine law to fit his desires. For others, adultery remained a sin. For him, it was sanctioned by heaven. What began as lust had become doctrine. What began as personal indulgence had become national law, and England itself was reshaped, not by justice nor by faith, but by one king's ungoverned desire. His subjects were forced to accept each new marriage as God's will, even as the bodies of previous queens were scarcely cold in their graves. Priests who resisted acknowledging his unions were branded as heretics and burned, creating a grotesque reality where obedience to Henry's desires became synonymous with religious orthodoxy. Sexual submission to the king was no longer a private matter. It was doctrine. Henry's obsession with a male heir turned every encounter in his bedchamber into an affair of state. His wives were reduced to breeding vessels, their worth measured only by their ability to deliver princes. The cruel irony was undeniable. All his restless scattering of heirs produced only one legitimate son who survived childhood. Edward VI, the longed-for boy, died at just 15. It was his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, bastardized and legitimized by their father's marital whims, who would outlast him to rule England. Their triumph revealed the futility of Henry's obsession, proving that the future of England would belong not to his sons, but to his discarded daughters. The psychological wounds inflicted on those children ran deep. Mary Tudor grew up watching her mother humiliated and cast aside, hardening into the merciless queen who later consigned Protestants to the flames. Elizabeth, whose mother, Anne Boleyn, was executed when she was not yet 3, never married at all, perhaps a calculated decision shaped by the deadly lessons of her father's court. Even Edward, the fragile heir, spent his brief life within a palace haunted by women elevated and destroyed at his father's will. Beyond the palace walls, Henry's obsessions had poisoned noble society. Families began treating their daughters as potential offerings, grooming them for royal attention while silently praying they would be overlooked. Participation in this dangerous game was unavoidable. To resist meant ruin, to succeed often meant destruction. Sir Thomas More kept his principles and lost his head. Thomas Cromwell helped deliver queens into Henry's grasp, only to be executed when his usefulness expired. Everyone, no matter how loyal, lived on borrowed time. The international consequences were equally devastating. Henry's relentless pursuit of new brides isolated England from Catholic Europe. His cruel treatment of Katherine of Aragon permanently fractured ties with Spain. His dismissal of Anne of Cleves strained relations with German Protestant states. Foreign courts watched in disgust as England's monarch turned his lust into national policy, murdering wives and declaring himself God's chosen authority on marriage. The legal legacy he left behind was even more disturbing. Laws were rewritten at his whim to justify new marriages or destroy unwanted wives. Treason itself was redefined to include adultery against the king, effectively making dissatisfaction in his bed a capital offense. Succession acts were torn apart and rewritten, bastardizing and legitimizing children depending on who currently lay beside him. English law itself bent under the weight of one man's appetite. Medical historians have long speculated about what drove Henry's spiral into cruelty. Some point to the jousting accident of 1536 that left him unconscious for hours, perhaps damaging his brain and unleashing darker impulses. Others have suggested venereal disease, though the evidence is weak. Whatever the cause, the truth remains that unchecked power, cloaked in divine authority and inflamed by obsessive desire, created a perfect storm of tyranny. Even after Henry's death in 1547, the shadow of his reign lingered. The Church of England, born from his desire to annul Katherine and marry Anne, became a permanent institution. The precedent of royal supremacy over religion, created to serve his lust, would echo through civil wars and constitutional crises for centuries. The Tower of London remained haunted. 2 queens and countless lesser women had met their deaths there, all casualties of a monarch's insatiable appetites. Some modern historians have tried to soften his image by claiming his actions reflected Tudor norms. But even measured against his own century, Henry's conduct was monstrous. Other kings kept mistresses, but few executed their wives in cold succession. Other rulers sought annulments, but none shattered the unity of the Catholic Church for them. Henry's obsessions were not private sins. They were weapons of terror wielded on the grandest stage of Europe. The tragedy lay not only with his wives, but with the ripple of generational trauma. Brothers testified against sisters, fathers sacrificed daughters to royal lust. The Howard family alone suffered the deaths of 2 queens and the ruin of countless relatives. England itself was reshaped around the unstable desires of a single man. Perhaps most chilling of all was Henry's lack of remorse. On his deathbed, he displayed no regret, no acknowledgement of the lives destroyed. He went to the grave convinced that every execution, every annulment, every discarded woman had been sanctioned by God himself. In his mind, his will and divine will were inseparable, a delusion that cost thousands of lives and permanently scarred English history. The cultural impact was equally profound. Portraits of his wives were hidden, destroyed, or altered, erasing their very faces as though their existence was too dangerous to remember. Writers tiptoed around the themes of marriage and sexuality, fearing a misplaced word could be interpreted as treason. The once rich traditions of courtly love poetry were replaced with propaganda exalting whichever queen currently held royal favor. Henry's sexual legacy poisoned marriage within the monarchy for generations. Elizabeth I's celebrated virginity can be read as both defiance and survival, a daughter who had seen what surrender meant. Later, Stuart monarchs struggled with the precedent Henry set, as royal marriage itself became a political weapon that could ignite civil war. Even today, the British Crown grapples with the shadow of Tudor precedent, where marriage is never simply personal, it is national spectacle. The very palaces where Henry pursued his obsessions remain as monuments to his victims. Hampton Court and the Tower still whisper of queens humiliated, betrayed, and destroyed. In the darkest corners of these halls, history remembers what Henry himself never could, that beneath the crown, beneath the robes and power, lay a man enslaved by his own desires and a nation forced to pay the price. Hampton Court Palace, where Henry honeymooned with multiple wives, is said to echo with Catherine Howard's screaming ghost. The Tower of London draws thousands who come to stand where Anne Boleyn lost her head for failing to produce a son. These landmarks, marketed today as tourist attractions, remain grim monuments, reminders that beneath the polished Tudor history lies a raw truth of sexual exploitation and judicial murder. Economic historians have traced the staggering costs of Henry's obsessions. His break with Rome cut off vast church revenues. The executions of nobles not only destroyed families, but also redistributed their wealth to the crown. Endless marriage negotiations, annulments, and ceremonies drained the treasury. England's entire economy was reshaped to serve the king's bedroom. Even the dissolution of monasteries, a seismic religious act, was in part driven by Henry's hunger for funds to finance his matrimonial experiments. The intellectual climate of England was equally warped. Scholars who might have advanced Renaissance thought were reduced to justifying royal marriages or defending Henry's ever-shifting religious policies. The Protestant Reformation in England, which elsewhere was a battle of ideas, became here inseparably tied to the king's sexual demands. Academic discourse turned into sexual apologetics. For women, already precariously placed in Tudor society, Henry's reign was devastating. If queens themselves could be executed on flimsy charges, what safety did ordinary women have? His message was clear. Women existed to serve male desire. Even queens, consort, seemingly exalted, were only secure as long as they held the king's fleeting interest. Their crowns were nothing but gilded cages. Internationally, England's reputation suffered badly. Once regarded as a civilized Christian kingdom, it became known as a rogue state, where the king's lust overruled law and tradition. Foreign ambassadors wrote home in disbelief about the latest execution or forced marriage. In the eyes of Europe, England had become barbaric, a kingdom where queens were disposable. That perception of savagery would shadow England's diplomacy for generations. Henry's own writings reveal the depths of his delusions. His theological treatises bent logic into impossible knots. He argued his marriage to Katherine was invalid because she had been his brother's widow, yet Anne's marriage was void because he had known her sister. Desire dictated theology. Contradictions that should have been laughable became national law, and thousands of Englishmen had to pretend they made sense. Medical records of Henry's later life paint a grotesque portrait. His legs were ulcerated and constantly oozing. His obesity left him struggling to walk, and impotence loomed. Yet he pursued young women with relentless determination. Katherine Parr's private accounts suggest humiliating attempts at intimacy, acts less about pleasure and more about proving virility he no longer possessed. Even near death, his obsession was not with governance, but with the illusion of sexual dominance. The religious fallout extended far beyond England. Henry's split with Rome worsened the fragmentation of Western Christianity. Wars would rage across Europe, killing hundreds of thousands, fueled partly by the chain reaction his divorce set into motion. The Protestant Reformation, an epic movement of faith and power, was forever stained by its link to one king's sexual will. Even his burial spoke volumes. Henry was laid to rest beside Jane Seymour, the one wife who had given him his coveted son. Katherine of Aragon and Anne of Cleves, who survived him, were excluded. Even in death, Henry ranked his wives according to sexual usefulness. His will requested endless Catholic masses for his soul, a bitter irony given that he himself had dismantled the church institutions that could have provided them. In the aftermath of his death, his victims were carefully reinterpreted. Katherine Parr quickly remarried, revealing her marriage to Henry as more strategy than love. Anne of Cleves, who had shrewdly accepted her divorce, lived comfortably as the king's beloved sister. But the dead queens could not be rehabilitated so easily. Their names remained shrouded in danger. Modern forensic re-examination of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard's trials exposes just how flimsy the cases were. These trials were showpieces, verdicts scripted before testimony began. The specific accusations, multiple adultery, incest, even same-sex relations, were chosen not for truth but for humiliation. Henry had weaponized sexuality itself, turning natural human desires into capital crimes when it suited him. The psychological profile that emerges is chilling. Henry fits the portrait of a malignant narcissist with compulsive sexual drives, reinforced by absolute power and divine authority. He showed no empathy, no recognition that his wives and mistresses were human beings. His ability to execute one woman and immediately pursue another reveals a sociopathy expressed through sexual domination. His artistic legacy reflects this corruption. Beyond the surviving palaces and portraits lies a tradition of historical storytelling that attempts to reclaim humanity for his victims. From early ballads mourning Anne Boleyn to modern novels and television, creators have sought to restore dignity to women Henry reduced to objects. Katherine Howard is remembered not just as a foolish girl but as a child victim of abuse. Anne Boleyn emerges not merely as a schemer, but as a brilliant woman destroyed by a tyrant's desire. Legal scholars still study Henry's reign as a warning about power and law. The ease with which statutes were rewritten to suit his sexual whims demonstrates how fragile legal systems become under autocrats. The very principle that law applies equally to all was shattered. In Henry's England, the king's bed became the Supreme Court. Economically, his sexual pursuits created an entire shadow market. Noble families prostituted their daughters in pursuit of advancement. The Boleyn family's meteoric rise and catastrophic fall revealed the stakes of this game. Families poured fortunes into preparing daughters for court, dressing exploitation in the language of ambition. In reality, they were gambling their lives on Henry's fleeting lust. Henry VIII's reign left behind more than the ruins of marriages. It reshaped England's religion, economy, diplomacy, and society, all bent to satisfy one man's compulsions. His palaces remain standing, but they are haunted by the women he destroyed, the families he ruined, and the nation he forever scarred. Henry's impact on English masculinity was equally poisonous. He modeled a version of manhood built on conquest, cruelty, and domination, where virility was measured not by character, but by the number of women possessed and discarded. This royal template of toxic masculinity, endorsed by both monarchy and church, left a shadow across English society for generations. Men learned that sexual desire justified brutality and that a woman's worth could be reduced to her ability to gratify or produce heirs. The international marriage market was permanently altered. Foreign princesses, once eager to secure English alliances, grew wary after the fates of Katherine of Aragon and Anne of Cleves. The traditional role of queens as peace weavers between nations was shattered when it became clear that an English king might not only reject his bride, but humiliate or execute her. Diplomatic marriages, once considered stabilizing, became dangerous negotiations where life and death hung on the king's unpredictable appetites. Henry's obsessions also created a culture of surveillance and paranoia that spread beyond the palace walls. Bedchambers became arenas of state intelligence. Servants spied on masters, ladies-in-waiting whispered about queens, and even casual words could be reported as treason. The line between public and private collapsed. A monarch's sexual satisfaction became a national security issue, and everyone from laundresses to noblemen could find themselves interrogated over what they had seen or heard. The theological gymnastics required to justify Henry's marriages left permanent marks on English Christianity. The Church of England was born from his need to annul, remarry, and legitimize as he pleased. Scripture was bent, twisted, and reinterpreted, always in service of royal lust. This flexibility, born from expediency, would ironically contribute to England's later reputation for religious tolerance. But its origin was not freedom. It was fear, written in the language of desire. Education, too, was reshaped. Universities once designed to train Catholic clergy were retooled to produce lawyers and theologians skilled in defending royal supremacy, including in matters of sex and marriage. Curricula shifted towards subjects useful for rationalizing Henry's choices. Classical texts were mined for precedents supporting divorce. Inconvenient passages of scripture were quietly explained away. Students learned not truth, but obedience. Intellectual servitude dressed as scholarship. The impact on childhood was particularly cruel. Noble children grew up knowing they might be sacrificed to royal lust. Young girls were trained from an early age in the accomplishments that might catch a king's eye, yet simultaneously warned of the mortal dangers attached. The innocence of youth was corrupted in a world where children could become queens or corpses, based on an aging tyrant's whims. Henry's legacy included the normalization of state violence in service of private desire. He proved that with sufficient power, any crime could be legalized, any murder justified, any cruelty sanctified. Parliament, courts, and church bent themselves to accommodate royal lust. This precedent of institutional compliance with autocracy echoed long after his death, feeding the political culture that would eventually spark civil wars aimed at limiting monarchical power. The demographic impact, though subtle, was undeniable. Noble families began hiding their daughters away, keeping them in the countryside rather than exposing them to court life. The traditional system of educating young nobles within the royal household was disrupted, parental fear reshaping the very fabric of aristocratic society. The risk was no longer merely political, it was sexual predation endorsed at the highest level. Modern psychological analysis suggests Henry suffered from multiple disorders, likely worsened by his 1536 jousting accident. Severe head trauma could explain his violent mood swings, paranoia, and ability to dissociate. His habit of ordering executions in the morning and feasting jovially by night reveals a chilling detachment. In an increasingly fragmented psyche, sexual compulsion became one of the few constants, a destructive thread of continuity that defined his reign. Cultural memory preserved the archetypes born under Henry: the lustful tyrant, the disposable queen, the ambitious family pushing a sacrificial daughter, all became permanent fixtures in English imagination. Every royal scandal afterward would be measured against the Tudor template. The grim schoolyard rhyme: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Reduced systemic exploitation and judicial murder to a sing-song chant that even children carried into the future. The physical remnants of his obsessions remain etched into Tudor architecture. Excavations reveal hastily altered buildings, queenly emblems chiseled away and replaced, palace chambers remodeled at dizzying speed to erase one wife and prepare for the next. The very stones bear witness to the instability of royal lust. Palace inventories show jewels, gowns, and estates passed from one queen to another in frantic cycles of rise and ruin. Henry's influence poisoned English law as well. The expansion of treason to include sexual betrayal of the monarch created a precedent where private behavior became grounds for execution. Catherine Howard's trial, which relied heavily on torture to extract confessions, normalized judicial brutality. The idea that justice should be blind collapsed when the king's bedroom dictated verdicts. The final accounting of Henry's reign must include not only his famous victims, but also the countless unnamed ones. For every queen executed, dozens of women endured his advances and survived only by luck or cleverness. For every documented mistress, there were maids, servants, and subjects whose stories were never recorded. The true scale of his predation will never be fully known. As the Tudor age gave way to the Stuart era, England began to slowly recover from the trauma. Judicial murder of wives became unthinkable. The principle that royal marriages required parliamentary approval was established, limiting absolute marital authority. The Church of England evolved beyond its origins as a weapon for divorce and remarriage. Yet the scars lingered. Every monarch who followed tread carefully around the precedent Henry had set, and England's permanent break from Rome remained the ultimate consequence of his bedroom. Today, visitors to Tudor palaces wander through halls where sexual exploitation once stood as state policy. They admire portraits of women who lived in terror, gaze at jewels once used as bribes for compliance, and walk through rooms financed by wealth seized from monasteries dissolved to fuel Henry's appetites. The heritage industry sanitizes Henry as a colorful Renaissance king. But behind the storytelling lies a darker truth. He was a predator who reshaped a nation through desire. The lessons of Henry VIII's sexual tyranny remain stark. They show how personal pathology, when fused with unchecked power, can destroy not only individuals, but institutions. They show how entire societies can be made complicit, rationalizing murder as divine will, sacrificing daughters and sisters to the whims of a king. In the end, Henry's reign stands as one of history's clearest warnings about the corruption of absolute power. A monarch who began as a golden prince of the Renaissance ended as a bloated tyrant, consumed by compulsions that destroyed lives and warped nations. His obsessions transformed England's religion, law, and culture, proving that when sexuality becomes a tool of tyranny, entire civilizations can be reshaped by a single man's ungoverned desires. The tragedy lies not only in the women who died, but in the systemic corruption that enabled him, the courtiers who looked away, the families who offered daughters, the churchmen who rewrote scripture. England learned to live with sexual tyranny, and in learning, carried the scars for centuries. Even now, echoes of Henry's reign linger in culture, law, and memory. A king who once embodied Renaissance promise instead became the cautionary tale of how lust and power, fused together, can unravel the very soul of a nation.